NAMBA. We're getting ready to get started. First of all, thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar about racial bias in appraisal. I actually have been looking forward to this webinar. I think it's a really awesome topic that really a couple weeks ago I read an article in the New York Times, and it kind of made me think about this upcoming webinar. So first and foremost, I want to let you know that today's webinar is brought to you by our partners at Reggora and NAMBA. Again, for those who I have not had the opportunity to meet, I'm Tony Thompson, founder and CEO of NAMBA, and I'm really excited to be partnering with Reggora today to talk about a topic about racial disparity in the mortgage industry and the potential role of data and technology. Before we get started, I've been asked to really make sure we take care of a few housekeeping items. First, a very popular question everyone asks, will this webinar be recorded? That answer is yes. We will share the recording with all of you via email later on after the event. Secondly, if you have any questions throughout the event, please enter your question in the GoToWebinar control panel on the right side of your screen. Depending on how much time we have available, your question will be either answered live or we will have the appropriate person respond back to your answer directly, because we want to make sure there's been a lot of anticipation about this webinar, a lot of talk. So we want to make sure that we can definitely interact and communicate with everyone who has a question or certainly want to share their perspective about today's topic with Reggora as well. And with that, I would like to introduce our two presenters for today. I'm really excited to introduce Jillian White and Brian Zitin. Jillian is the head of collateral at Better.com. She's a 17-year veteran of the appraisal industry, an SRA designated appraiser, and a former New York State Appraisal Board member. Wow, we were just talking earlier before we came on. She's in the beautiful city of New York as well. In 2007, she was named Young Entrepreneur of the Year by Small Business Administration. And in 2010, Jillian was recognized as one of the 10 influential Blacks in Westchester County. Congratulations, Jillian. Jillian joined Better.com in 2016, and she is now the head of collateral leading a 600-person department that consists of appraisal, title, insurance, and project certification teams. She received her BA in neuroscience and behavior from Columbia University. Jillian, thanks for joining us. Brian Zitin is the co-founder and CEO of Reggora, a venture-backed startup that provides software to speed up the appraisal process for mortgage lenders and real estate appraisers. Prior to Reggora, Brian co-founded a real estate brokerage called Sunder Partners, and it was this experience that exposed Brian to the inefficiencies in the modern appraisal process and led him and his co-founder to launch Reggora in 2016. Brian has been named to Forbes 30 Under 30 and was also named a Housing Wire Tech Trendsetter in 2020. Congratulations on that award as well, Brian. Having said that, I am excited to be here to participate. I'm gonna now go ahead and pass over the torch to Brian to get us started for today.
Awesome, thank you, Tony. I will flick on my camera here. I know that Jillian will be joining me shortly on this video as well. There she is. Hey, Jillian. So super excited to dive in today. I'm glad we could use it to just bring more awareness in general. And so basically, I'm your humble moderator here. I'm going to dive into a Q&A with Jillian to get her perspective on all of this in a bit. Before that, wanted to at least provide some context here. Like I said, firstly, super important topic. It's also one that is very complex, controversial. People get emotional sometimes discussing it, as they should. And we are not here today. We do not think that we will be able to solve racism necessarily in a 60-minute webinar. That's going to take many more conversations with people who have much higher pay grades than myself, at least. And so I want to be clear that the topics today don't get confused with accusations of intentional racism, anything like that. A lot of what we're going to be focusing on is not that individual appraisers are intentionally being discriminatory, but rather around how racial bias can potentially materialize in other ways. So we also, aren't necessarily presenting solutions that we have. Once again, extremely complex topic, many overlapping factors. That being said, just bringing more general awareness and having more conversations and getting perspectives of super smart folks like Jillian, we think is the best way to facilitate that. So with that, I want to dive into the questions here. To set the stage a little bit, Jillian, not everyone in this webinar, although there's probably a lot of appraisal folks, are not as, they don't live and breathe appraisal like us every day. So could you just maybe provide a high level overview in terms of how the appraisal works today?
Sure. And thank you for having me, Brian. Thank you for the intro, Tony. So very happy to be here talking to you all today about this topic. But a high-level overview of the appraisal for those who don't know. An appraisal assignment will be given to an appraiser, and typically, and I say typically because there's some things going on with COVID right now that have some changes being made, but most of the time the appraiser will go to the property and do a physical inspection of both the interior and the exterior of the home. And then afterwards they'll go back to their office and begin the research aspect of it. And so in mortgage lending, the predominant approach to value is the sales comparison approach. And that's really when the appraiser compares the subject property, which is the property that's being appraised, to other comparable sales in the area. And so the comps are selected. For every appraisal report, there's a minimum of 3 sales that have to be included. And so the appraiser will input these comparables into the sales comp grid, that's what we call it, and then they'll make adjustments. So let's say the first comparable is superior to the subject property in some sort of way. The appraiser will then make a negative adjustment to bring that house down to like the subject property's level. Or let's say the second comparable is inferior in some sort of way. Then the appraiser will make a positive adjustment to level the two out. And so what happens is with each of the comparables, there is typically a combination of positive and negative adjustments. And then when you tally all of them up, you get an adjusted value. And so since every appraisal has to have a minimum of 3 closed sales, at minimum, the appraiser will have 3 adjusted values to take a look at. And then at that point, they're going to reconcile their value and figure out where they want the appraised value to come in within that range. However, one thing I want to point out is that the estimate of value provided by the appraiser and the definition of an appraisal is an opinion of value. So it's really the appraiser's opinion of the house using the market data to create a report and support their opinion.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, it's always an interesting thing when people think, what is something worth? It's what someone's willing to pay for. And so, we have to give, opinions on that, which the appraisers give. So that's helpful. So now that we know the general overview of kind of how the appraisal works, can you explain maybe how bias may impact value in that regard?
Yeah, so I think anytime you're dealing with opinions, bias has an opportunity to present itself. However, in the appraisal process, it really can fall under 3 different areas. So the first one would be the comp selection. Let's say in an average neighborhood, there are like 15 sales that happened recently that the appraiser might take a look at and consider. And let's say they throw out 5 of them because they're not truly comparable. They're too dissimilar from the subject property, or anybody who's interested in buying the subject property might not be interested in buying one of those other houses. So you throw them out. Now there's still 10 comps. It is at the appraiser's discretion to make the determination about which comparable sales to include in their report. And again, we're dealing with opinions. So one appraiser's opinion might differ from another appraiser's opinion right out the gate with a comp selection. Then when it comes time to make the adjustments to the comparables, the appraisers are operating within certain parameters. So appraisers do not dictate the market. The market dictates like how much something is worth. And let's use an extra bedroom, for example. when the appraiser is doing their analysis to find out by how much they should make the adjustment, it's not a pinpoint precise number like, okay, you should make a $7,000 adjustment here. Typically, it's a range. This market seems to pay, anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 more for an additional bedroom. And so again, it's at the appraiser's discretion to determine where within that range they're going to make their adjustments. And there are huge implications if they use the lower end of the adjustments versus the higher end. And then finally, the reconciliation of the value. So again, at a minimum, an appraiser is going to include 3 closed sales. Most appraisers include more. They throw in a couple of listings as well. So you have all of these adjusted values. And also sometimes you'll have a large range. Let's say it's anywhere from, I don't know, 350,000 to 400 or 450,000. Again, it's up to the appraiser to reconcile that and to say which comparables they gave the greatest emphasis to, because in their opinion, this house is more comparable to the subject than others. So between the comp selection, the adjustment, again, within the range that the market dictates, and the reconciliation of value, there's a lot of room for artistry and not just a strict science. And so that's where the bias can creep in. That's where all of the opinions are. And so that's how it can show up in the appraisal process.
I think that's a solid insight. Yeah, I love the words that you use there. And I've heard that before from appraisers when I was first learning about how they reconcile reports. And it's definitely more of an art than a science. So there's both aspects, obviously, but there is some of that area that you discussed. So that's helpful. So, given that, to your point, there is some potential for bias. I think a lot of people get confused when on this topic, what that word bias means and how that could materialize. Can you maybe go into the difference? And we've heard you talk about this a little bit before, but can you explain the difference between an individual's potential bias and then structural bias and the differences and just kind of the general framework that you think about in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So the articles that have been in the news and the things that we're seeing that really made this a trending topic that everybody's talking about, those articles are oftentimes talking about the individual bias of an appraiser. And typically that is an unconscious bias. They go in, they look around, and their opinion in some sort of way is altered as a result of the inhabitants of the home. And so that is on a person by person basis. We all have bias. Our biases are different just based on our life experiences. However, there's also structural bias as well, which has absolutely nothing to do with the individual, but it has to do with the system within the individual operates. And so an appraising example of that is redlining. Back when redlining was the practice of literally drawing a red line around Black neighborhoods and saying, do not lend there, and white neighborhoods had green lines and they could get mortgage financing, even though that was outlawed in 1968. Today, we still see the remnants of redlining. So if you live in an area that at any point in its history was redlined, or another way of putting it, if you live in an area that at any point in time was a predominantly Black neighborhood, then your property values would not have appreciated at the same rate as those of white neighborhoods or green line neighborhoods. So now you take an appraiser, and let's say they're the most unbiased appraiser, they have an awareness of everything, and they do the most perfect appraisal ever. Within the constraints of appraisal practice, they still have to pick comparable sales that sold recently, that they put into their sales comp grid. And so if the options that they have, if those property values have been suppressed as a result of redlining, that can't be solved for on the individual bias basis, because it has nothing to do with the individual. It has to do with the whole system. And again, there's nothing wrong with the sales comparison approach. It's just it's propagating what was done in the past, and the gap still hasn't been bridged, and it can never be bridged while using the sales comp approach.
I think that is worth expanding on a little bit. So and correct me if I'm wrong, just to try to summarize. So to your point in the first question, how appraisers are determining value, they're looking at comparable sales and kind of back engineering that to get to the value. But if historically comparable sales have been, deflated through outside means outside of just the market forces, then today there's a potential for almost like a self-referencing loop of sorts in that regard. That literally the appraiser could be the best appraiser in the world, super analytic, but because of this kind of potential for structural bias, that could affect the value.
Yeah,
Is that
absolutely.
correct?
That is correct. So tackling individual bias won't move the needle on the structural bias. So it's actually two separate sets of problems that need two very different sets of solutions.
Yeah, it's interesting. You usually see, like, to your point, the New York Times, things like that, highlighting the individual part of it versus the structural and something like that. So that usually gets a little bit more clicks probably in that regard. So building off of that, so a lot of the kind of like headlines and news came about from this study from Brookings, by Perry et al. It was called the Devaluation of Assets in Black Neighborhoods, and where they basically looked at predominantly Black neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods and applied, I think it was, literally 23 controls, run a regression, and concluded, to your point, that the homes in the majority Black neighborhoods were undervalued by 23% compared to identical or similar neighborhoods that are, predominantly white. And so recently, the AEI Housing Center put together a study that built off of that, essentially, that added in more controls, which also controlled for not just the original ones, but also like crime and also income level. And the difference between the gap was still present, but it went from 23 to 14, and then for income it went to 9. So still a gap, even while controlling for those things. But the main point of their study was, a lot of these policies should be kind of geared more towards income sort of thing. But just how do you think that sort of analysis overlaps with some of the structural things that we were talking about, or just bias in general?
I know on my end, I'm much more interested in kind of forward thinking and thinking, okay, now that we know that this gap exists, what are we going to do about it, versus trying to quantify the exact size and scope of that gap, because both studies agree that there is a gap and disparities. So whether it's the 23%, the 14%, the 9%, I think for any of us, when we're living in our homes and somebody says, I'm going to reduce your property value by 23%. Oh, never mind. 14%. Oh, you know what? 9%. You're still not going to be happy. You're going to be like, I want that 9% back. So I think both of them are essentially saying the same thing, which is there is a gap. And now it's like, what do we do about it? Because it's very nuanced and complex.
Not 9% of 6-7 figures, still definitely a decent sum of change. So that's very fair, and obviously always better to work towards the future than look towards the past, sort of thing. But so in that regard, one of the, in terms of addressing the gap, people have brought up, and this is maybe more geared towards kind of the individual bias versus the structural bias kind of area. The appraisal industry is not very diverse. Most appraisers, I think the percentages vary depending on kind of which source you look at, but very, very small number of minorities compared to, white appraisers in the space. Do you think that this contributes in any way? And if so, I mean, do you have any, how should people go about improving this, or does it matter? Like, what are the general thoughts in terms of the actual diversity of the appraisers themselves?
Yeah, so I can throw out some of the stats that I use, and I think they are from the Appraisal Institute, and that 85% of appraisers are white, 70% of appraisers are male, and 1.5% of appraisers are Black, and then the vast majority are at or near retirement age. So I think anytime you're having a conversation about race or bias or discrimination, a lack of diversity does not work in your favor. And also too, when you're talking about opinions, and so you have this very homogenous group attaching their opinions to the value of the homes that people who don't look like them live in. I don't think the lack of diversity is moving the conversation forward in the least bit. And so in terms of what to do about it, the appraiser population has to start looking like the population that it serves. And so to that end, new appraisers, diverse appraisers needs to be brought in just to kind of level things out and make it look like the way the country looks currently today. And so at Better, we have an initiative where we're bringing in a new trainee appraisers and kind of training them from the ground up, and with a heavy emphasis on diversity to get our appraisers to look like the populations that they're serving. Because as a digital lender, oftentimes the only face of Better that anybody sees is the face of the appraiser. And so, like, wouldn't it be nice if that looked like our borrowers?
That is awesome. Yeah, and then there's, I mean, it's constantly talked about as terms of a problem in the industry that there's a lack of appraisers, no new appraisers are coming in, that sort of thing. People, mostly people complaining about it in the light of turn times and capacity and things like that. But it is interesting that even by potentially, it could be a win-win where the people complaining about turn times and things like that could also benefit kind of the diversity of initiative by bringing in new types of folks in the industry and kind of, fostering that. So that, I know there's a variety of efforts in terms of like PREA and things like that to improve, bring in more trainees into the industry. So hopefully that works out, because I know that is a big emphasis for a lot of folks.
I think it'll be a win across the board.
Awesome. Well, speaking of kind of changes, and you alluded to it in the beginning of this a little bit. So obviously, around the world, COVID has kind of accelerated technology in a variety of areas. About a year ago, COVID hit. Crazy appraisal was one of the more effective things. In a pandemic, letting a stranger into your home is like one of the last things that people typically want to do. So how do you think, well, how has COVID and all the kind of changes that went down with appraisal regulations in terms of flexibilities, or even maybe some of the not COVID related, but new-ish things like appraisal waivers and alternative products, how do you think that those either help or hurt the issue of racial bias in appraisal? Do they have any effect? Would love to just get your opinion on some of the newer things that are happening.
Sure. So first, let's start with what are some of the newer things that are happening. So to your point, Brian, at the start of the pandemic, appraisers didn't want to go into the houses of homeowners for fear of infection, and the homeowners didn't want to let the stranger appraiser in for the same exact reason. And so there was a time there I was like, oh goodness, all right, if we can't get the appraisal process going, is all of mortgage lending going to come to a screeching halt? And that was not the case because these flexibilities came out. And so really, I look at them as three flexibilities. The first one being exterior only appraisals. And so historically for loan origination, we weren't able to, it had to be an interior exterior. Now you're able to get an exterior only appraisal. And it's exactly what it sounds like. The appraiser goes and drives by the exterior of the property, takes pictures of the exterior, never goes inside. And so they're able to bridge the gap in the information they don't have by either conversations with the borrower, photos provided by the borrower, photos that are already in the MLS, whatever information that they have. So that's the first one. Then the second one was desktop appraisals, which again is exactly the way it sounds, where the appraisers are able to complete their appraisal reports from their desk. So not even an exterior inspection. And typically that's for properties where like it's known that there's a lot of public information available. And then the third bucket, and I don't know if it's like officially a flexibility, but you alluded to it as well. It's the waivers. So before we got, the percentage of waivers that we got, that number has increased by like 400%. And so a waiver is saying like, there's enough information on this property that no appraisal is needed at all. And so now for the first time ever, rather than dealing in extremes of either all, which is the full interior exterior appraisal, or nothing, which is the waiver, we now have these steps in between. And so going back to the topic of racial bias, I think as we're thinking about possible solutions and what to do, just having the conversation open up to something beyond the all or nothing paradigm that we were operating in before, I think that's very beneficial in terms of getting new ideas flowing and percolating. And then even outside of that, just having now a spectrum that you can overlap with the risk associated with the loan versus this all or nothing that we had before, I also think helps. So COVID has been a forcing function. Now we're going to have data on how these loans perform as compared to loans that have the traditional appraisal. And then I think that'll be the real test. Like if the performance is exactly the same, then it's going to be hard to make a case as to why we shouldn't have these steps in between the all or nothing.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. Unfortunately, probably going to take a bit of time to get that data because it's like all the way, you know, life of loans sort of thing. But totally agree, they have plenty of that now, so it'll be interesting to see. And as part of all of that, you know, in one of your early questions, you talk about where bias can potentially materialize. One of the concepts that's been, you know, constantly talked about in terms of like appraisal modernization and some of the new products that may be brought is this idea of still doing an interior inspection, but having a non-appraiser potentially do that inspection and then sending it back to an appraiser, either desktop or maybe to a computer. And so I'm wondering what you think in terms of, I don't think that in the earlier part of this, you mentioned that the inspection component necessarily is where bias could potentially materialize, but do you think that there's any impact by having non-appraiser workforce potentially completing inspections, both in terms of like their abilities to do an inspection compared to an appraiser maybe, and then maybe like the appraiser getting data that they've never physically seen with their eyes, and how that could potentially affect bias in any way? Do you think that has any impact?
I think it does. If I were an appraiser now out in the field and, you know, every other week there is an article about racial bias in appraising, having the opportunity to separate myself from the inspection would be tremendous. And so historically, the person who inspects the property necessarily has to be the same person who writes up the report. And so now what's coming out is the separation of the two, where you have a non-appraiser collect the data points from the actual inspection, and then the appraiser from their desktop writes up the report. I think the conversation about bias goes away when the two are separated, because if the appraiser is not interacting with the homeowner whatsoever, and also the photographs that are being provided to them, all hints of like family photos, hints of the occupants, religious artifacts, even pets, all of that have to be removed from the photographs. So really what the appraiser in that case would be dealing with is just the facts. So, you know, how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, and no inputs as to who the occupants are, or how that might change their opinion. And so I see it as really protecting appraisers from claims of bias if they aren't the one who's even interacting with the homeowner or the home to know the race. However, in addition to that, I also really like the idea of separating the two, because an appraiser's skill set is really focused on analyzing the data, taking a look at the comparable sales, making the selections, making the adjustments, reconciling their value. But most appraisers spend about half of their day in their car crisscrossing all across town, going from house to house. And so that's not the best use of their time. And so by separating out that process and really keeping the appraiser in the areas that they are trained to do, it frees up the workforce as well, and keeps everybody like really focused on the things that they do best. But again, on the racial bias front, I think it would protect appraisers from these accusations, because like then there's complete deniability. I do not know the race of the inhabitants.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. It's interesting because when you talk to different folks about this, one of the arguments about the concern of having a non-appraiser do it is the fidelity of the data. But it potentially goes both ways, you know, in terms of having that data come from someone else and not have any kind of potential bias from yourself gathering that. So that's an interesting point there. And then you had another point in terms of the fact that these appraisers are, spending a lot of their time driving around and things like that. I've heard a really great metaphor from other folks in the industry in terms of likening what the appraiser should be more like is the surgeon, versus like the person who's, the surgeon isn't necessarily doing all the prep in the entire room and all that sort of stuff. So that was a good metaphor that I liked. You do get some pushback from folks depending, obviously with any change, there's differing opinions, but super interesting to see kind of how that could potentially go both ways. So let's move on here, because it actually brings us to a good point, which is so we've talked about, okay, there's some potential, human involvement. It's an art versus a science sort of thing. Yet on the other side of the spectrum, you have AVMs, automated valuation models, like the Zillow's estimate. There's tons of different automated valuation models. I think that some people, maybe not as deep in the industry, think AVMs are much better or unbiased or anything. I think some people in the industry feel like AVMs don't do a great job with accuracy. What's your general thought in terms of like AVMs as it relates to potential racial bias and how that may materialize or not materialize in an algorithm sort of thing? Would love to just get your thoughts on AVMs as it relates to this topic.
So there's recently a study that came out highlighting how bias can even show up in the AVMs, and also for something like what I was talking about before with the redlining, the AVMs also are going to pull the data of the recent comparable sales, and so it's not devoid of bias. However, I think anytime something could be used in conjunction with one another, then it can be a checks and balances. So I don't necessarily think that the answer is just like do away with appraisers and move everything to AVMs, because I think the issues that we're seeing will manifest themselves just in slightly different ways. But anytime I think the appraiser can be empowered with additional information, additional inputs, especially now kind of as a checks and balances to their opinions, I think that is a win. And prior to joining Better, I was literally out in the field appraising properties in New York. And then I had to take a week off to clear out my folder before I could start my new job at Better. And one of the things I was amazed by is how much more access to data the lender has than the appraiser has. And I was like, wow, my reports would have been so much better had I had access to everything that a lender has access to. And so I think really empowering the appraisers to, number one, be able to kind of act as their own checks and balances, but also encouraging the use of technology and all the data sets that are available to them, and having all these work in conjunction with one another. Then we get into being able to catch the biases of one way of doing it against the other one, and also having like a red flag raised to the appraiser themselves before they submit the report. And so then they have the opportunity privately to go and take a look and challenge their own opinions before the report is out there and essentially the damage is done.
I think that's a great point. I mean, people try to be very black and white, but there is gray. And so having that nuanced view in terms of, it's not necessarily one or the other, it could be both. And it's interesting because, so you mentioned structural bias. People who don't know the way that AVMs work, like an AVM is doing the same thing as the appraiser, right? To your point, it's looking at comparable sales. To your point, it has more data, so people may plug into all the public record data and be able to run regressions, which maybe an individual appraiser won't. But it's still using the same data that an appraiser theoretically would try to use. So structural bias still potentially wouldn't escape an automated valuation model in that regard.
Yeah, exactly. However, there could be a flag if for whatever reason, like the appraised value or the opinion of value is trending kind of low, the AVM could flag and say, hey, wait a second, according to the data that we're using, it supports a higher valuation. And the appraiser might agree with that and go back and take another look and say, oh, okay, like, oh, my biases are showing up. Why is it that I think this particular house or this particular neighborhood is worth less, even though the data isn't supporting that? Or they might not, and they know exactly why their opinion is what it is. But at least now there's an opportunity for the opinions to be challenged. And so without that data, there isn't the same opportunity to even get the flag or be notified like, hey, perhaps you want to take a second look at this.
Right. Yeah, no, super great points. So it's, people, it's, once again, appraisers usually are nervous of total automation. Some people push for that. It's probably something in between, a combination of human, data, technology, all kind of working together to do the best result. So awesome. So I'm starting to see some good comments and questions come through. Feel free to, everyone in the audience, keep pushing them. We're almost, we kind of blew through a lot of that, so we're a little bit ahead. So we'll probably have some time to go through some of these questions. What recommendations do you have for lenders, or really anyone who's interested in kind of just learning more about the topic of racial bias in appraisal? And I don't know if you have specific resources or anything, but what recommendations do you have for other folks?
Sure. In terms of specific resources, I highly recommend reading the book, The Color of Law. So at Better, we have a racial equity speaker series, and Richard Rothstein, who is the author of that book, was one of the speakers. And so in preparation for that, as a company, we like created a book club and read The Color of Law. And it was really incredible because it connects very clearly how essentially the history of Black home ownership in this country. And there's a whole section about appraisal practice and what was considered acceptable appraisal practice at the time. And so for me, what was so fascinating is that, looking at the appraisal form on page 1, all appraisal forms or all URARs, there is a note in the neighborhood section. And the note says, race and racial composition are not factors in the appraisal. And so this book really speaks to like the history of that, because there was a point in time where race and racial composition were most certainly factors in the appraised value. And so just being able to kind of place the situation that we're in now in time and space and link it back to laws that were enacted years ago and then are now outlawed, but seeing the remnants of it, I think that's an excellent jumping off point or starting point. And then in terms of recommendations specific to lenders, really taking a look at your processes around reconsiderations of value. And so reconsideration of value is when it's typically on refinances, not always, but a borrower thinks their house is worth X number of dollars, the appraisal comes in low, and then there's an opportunity to like have a second look, re-examining that in terms of the sensitivity around racial bias. The conclusions might not be changed at all, but I think how lenders engage with their Black borrowers in these conversations is going to be incredibly important, because attaching a value or an opinion of value to somebody's home already, many people take that personally, and I think that's why tensions can run high for reconsiderations even under the best of circumstances. Now you take that and layer on top of it a conversation about race, tensions get really high. So just being cognizant of that and recognizing that as lenders, we're entering into like a whole new risk territory. So, a year ago, complaints of racial bias in appraising wasn't really a thing, or it certainly wasn't on my radar. And now that there has been so much press and attention on it, I think it really behooves all lenders to go back and say, okay, are we able to support our Black borrowers if they come to us with one of these claims? And are we doing so in a way that leaves them feeling like heard and seen? Again, the outcome might be exactly the same, but I think the way the lenders engaged really, you need to re-examine it. So that would be my
it's really relevant too, because, and I think I forget who sent it to me. I think someone on my team sent me an article recently. Appraisal values have been coming in low more frequently, right? So you see, you're starting to, because of the craziness of the market today, where people are sending, getting 30 offers as soon as they list the property, sort of thing. And one of the interesting notes was, if you think about that, let's say that a property goes, $100,000 over the asking price, whatever it may be, that's going to affect the loan to value and the amount ultimately that the borrower can get. And so the down payment might be higher. And going back to the income gap in some of the earlier point, like some people aren't able to just come up with an extra 20K, 30K, 40, you know, something like that. So
Yeah.
it's interesting how it all kind of, like I said in the beginning, so complex, so many different factors going into all this sort of thing. But those seem like really easy ways to kind of get started, at least examining things when you know, understanding the history. To your point again, I saw a different vendor in the space who's in the notary space talking about deeds that still today had provisions in them preventing the sale to Black people. And that, you know, me being 26, that's like a wild thing to imagine. So kind of understanding the history of that, I think would be beneficial for a lot of people. So yeah, great points. Actually, someone just asked, can you state the name of that book again that you just mentioned?
Yes, it is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein.
Cool. Awesome. Well, like I said, we have some time for questions. So there are a handful of questions here. So let me pull them up. And by the way, thank you so much. That was super helpful, and everything, Jillian. This is a longer question, so I'll just read it out. I think this is going back to the kind of individual bias AVM conversation around structure and picking the right comps, things like that. Someone said, appraisers still know the neighborhood, and our neighborhoods are more segregated than ever in many cities in the US. I don't know if there's truly a blind appraisal. Unfortunately, AVMs operate on data plagued by the historical devaluation of non-white communities. Is anyone talking about taking a risk on valuations, just making them better match similar properties in similar communities of a different demographic composition? So like, can you look at one neighborhood and look at like the characteristics of the property, and then maybe go a little bit further away that is a different demographic neighborhood, and does that help somehow, or what's the general thoughts in terms of that? I know that there's, as an appraiser, that's, you know, an interesting question. So I guess what do you think about that?
Yeah, that is an interesting question, and something that comes up like in appraiser groups for discussion. So the short answer is it possible? Yes, that's absolutely possible that an appraiser could go outside of that immediate area into other comparable areas that have experienced a greater amount of appreciation. Is that advisable in and of itself? And do I think like that is the solution in and of itself? Probably not. And the reason for that is a lot of a risk assessment and just like assessments around the overall quality of the report are based on the two, or really three concepts of how similar is the property, how recent is it, and how proximate it is. And so it gets very suspicious anytime recent proximate comps in the area are skipped over for other comparables in other areas. And so just at a glance, you would look and say, okay, well, why are you bypassing these comps in favor of these other ones? And then saying like, oh, I'm trying to go into neighborhoods that were in at any point in time red line, then that gets into a whole other unintended consequences. So one of them being, if you have people physically in the homes in, let's say, these predominantly Black neighborhoods, yes, they would benefit from that appreciation, but now new people wanting to come in get priced out of the neighborhood. And so there's this whole ripple effect. But I to answer the question, yes, that is possible, that could be done. Probably some variation of that would need to be done to kind of begin to level the playing field, but we have to keep a very close eye on what the ramifications down the line are of, you know, breaking away from what is standard appraisal practice completely in favor of something different, and make sure it's a holistic approach and not just like something that's operating in a vacuum or a bubble.
Yeah, right. Because I'm sure there's you probably have people on the other side that are like, well, location. That is a huge factor. You know, how do you gauge? You know, it's a very difficult. Once again, going back to the whole art versus science thing, with so many different overlapping factors. So,
I mean, talking about the location. So the studies that are being done are taking that into account, because absolutely, like, different locations have different amenities, different appeal. But even after you adjust for that, there are still disparities. So taking locations that are completely comparable and pulling comps from there. In the event that there are no recent sales in that particular area, and then you have to go out because there were no options there, that's fine and appropriate, and is often done when, like in rural areas where there aren't a lot of sales transacting, you have to go further out, further back in time. So yes, it is about location, but even when you adjust for the location, that disparity, whether it's 23%, 14%, or 9%, either way, there's this disparity that remains even when you account for that.
Right. So by the way, I'm looking at, this is the most questions I've ever seen in a webinar. There's like lots of questions in here. So I apologize if we don't get to all of them. I'm trying to comb through them right now. Someone made an interesting point in regards to the whole kind of separation of the inspection desktop thing, that appraisers could still be potentially biased based off of the borrower's surname. It's an interesting, interesting thought. Let me just go through this. Are you troubled by the this is maybe not as super specific to race. Are you troubled by the proliferation of appraisal waivers?
Oh, am I bothered by it? All right, I'm gonna wear two separate hats. As a lender, putting on my hat, the appraisal waivers certainly smooth out the origination process, and we have a lot of data to support how much faster those loans go through, and how much easier they are to create as a result of having a waiver. Putting on my appraiser hat and putting on my collateral risk hat, the fact, here's what gives me pause about the proliferation of the waivers, just by how much they have increased. So I fully anticipated that the number of waivers was going to go up as a result of COVID during like the initial conversations about this. That was my question, like, are we going to be getting more waivers now? But never could I have imagined that we would have seen the increase that we are seeing, like 400%. So part of me feels like, okay, you know, have the GSEs been holding out on us before, and they have access to some data in terms of what their risk tolerance is that they weren't sharing beforehand, or is this just a terrible, horrible idea that's going to blow up and these loans are going to underperform? I tend to lean towards the side that perhaps they have access to data and the performance that leads to them being this comfortable with granting so many waivers. But I was really taken aback by how much it increased. Like, I would have been surprised if they just doubled. Never could I have imagined a 400% increase.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, literally, I think for some refis, depending on your credit, it was like the majority of refis. So definitely scary in terms of everyone loves it until until another crisis happens or something like that.
Exactly.
So it matters when it matters. There's a couple quick ones that are probably, maybe we could rapid fire. What you mentioned at one point, you got to the lender side and you saw, wow, all this extra data that the lenders have that appraisers aren't using. What is some of the info that lenders would have that you would like shared with appraisers, or that you think would be beneficial for appraisers to have?
So collateral underwriter, having access to that. And so for those who don't know, that is like the risk score that gets associated with each appraisal report. And it's based off of what other appraisers, how other appraisers are handling the condition ratings or the quality ratings of those comps or the subject property that's included in the appraisal report. And then it gives you a risk score if there are any contradictions between what the appraiser is saying in their report and what other appraisers have said about those same comparables. Also lets you know if the appraiser is contradicting themselves, meaning they used comp 1 on Monday and called it C3 condition, and then they use that same comp on Tuesday and called it C4 condition. And so I was just like, wow, this would have been so helpful for me as an appraiser to see if I'm contradicting myself. And also, you know, knowing what my peers are doing and if I'm completely out of whack in terms of what their adjustments are, what their market data is telling them in terms of what kind of adjustments need to be made. So that was the one that was really eye-opening, and I was like, wow, you know, if I could have had access to this, it would have been fantastic back when I was in the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, common request from appraisers to be able to see some of that. I think the argument that some people have given is they don't want it to become that similar kind of self-referencing loop where, oh, I said this in the past, so I'm going to say it again, you know, that sort of thing. But yeah, I'm sure the general availability of data always helps. So I'm sure that they're hopefully working on some things like that. I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Once again, trying to look for ones that can just be answered relatively quickly. Someone asked, is it true? And I guess this could factor in terms of maybe some racial implications. Is it true that appraisals should not look at school performance?
No, I have not heard that. So I can speak to the market that I cover. So I covered Westchester County, and the school performance had a huge impact on the pricing of the property. Sometimes you see $100,000 difference across the street just based on the performance of that school district. So no, I haven't heard that shouldn't be a factor. And also too, going back to the principle of substitution, if you're to substitute the subject property for another home, then you can consider that comparable. When looking for a home, the school district is a major factor in that. So if someone would favor one property over another because of the education that their children would receive, then that kind of knocks out that property as being comparable, because people often shop based on the school district.
Yeah, no, totally valid point. Last one, or maybe we can fit in two, but so someone asked, you mentioned where the place that lenders can start looking towards is the reconsideration of value process. Someone asked, is there a standardized process for reconsideration of values? If there is not, is that part of the problem?
So I'll start with the second part of the question first. Is that part of the problem? No, I don't think the process of the reconsideration of value is part of the problem. Every lender handles this differently. So when I joined Better, I had to stand up what our reconsideration of value process is. I was speaking from a collateral risk perspective. So now in the news, there's just like article after article about racial bias in appraising, which I think collectively the lender community believes that the number of claims of racial bias is going to go up. And so previously, it was really simple to handle all reconsiderations of value in exactly the same way, because there are a lot of themes. Normally, they always come from a borrower whose appraised value came in low. So you never hear anything from a borrower whose value hit. So that's the first thing. And then the borrower will like pull together the evidence that they have as to why they think this appraisal is incorrect. And so we've been handling that as a lender community, you know, since the beginning of appraising. However, what has changed now is just, I think the visibility for one, and also the sensitivity of the topic. So it's one thing if a borrower comes to you and says, hey, this appraiser measured my house wrong. I have, you know, 200 additional square feet that weren't included. And I have a 3-car garage, not a 2-car garage, and there's a pool in the back that wasn't notated. That is dealing with something that's very concrete and very tangible. The risk with bias is that it does not lend itself to being measured in that same way. Yet at the same time, given the history of this country and given the history of appraising and given the fact that every human being has bias, there is something to the claims being made. And so both investigating it and trying to pin down something as opaque as bias, while at the same time adhering to the guidelines and making sure that you're not shopping around for value, and also making sure that bias doesn't become the buzzword for a borrower to just get a second appraisal, because that won't work either. Trying to navigate all of those, I think that requires a completely separate process. than the standard reconsiderations of value that we were seeing in months and years past.
Cool. Super helpful. Last one for sure, because we're almost at the hour, but I think this is one that kind of touches on, the message that we definitely wanted to make sure that we emphasize at the beginning of this. Do you think that some appraisers are being biased on purpose? I guess, the general question around intent and that sort of thing.
So being an appraiser, I asked myself this question, and my answer came quickly and it was very definitive. No, I do not think appraisers are entering into black saying, oh my goodness, when I thought you were white, your appraisal is going to come in here, and now that I've seen you, your appraisal is going to come in here. That takes a lot of work, that takes a lot of energy, that takes a lot of intent. I do not think that is what is going on at all. What I do think is going on is that the appraiser group, which we know is very homogenous, older white males are entering into black and brown spaces, or just spaces that are classified as other, and their opinions of those spaces are changing unbeknownst to them. So I think it's running in the background and it's showing itself in the dollar valuation. But no, I do not think there is active intent like, oh my goodness, I'm going to make sure to devalue the homes of Black people and people of color. No.
Awesome. Well, we are at the full top of the hour. So Jillian, thank you so much. This was really great. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. If you weren't able to get your answer to your question, we will follow up. Would really appreciate it. There is a survey at the end of this, for participants, just to give your feedback. So would really appreciate if anyone could fill that out. Otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in. Everyone had a great time. Jillian, Tony, thank you again. Hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye.